Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Hopkins Hour. My name is Tamara Ownsworth. I'm Research Director at the Hopkins Centre, and it's my pleasure to be hosting the first Hopkins Hour for the year on the topic of pathways to inclusive and sustainable employment. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our Hopkins Centre members, partners and collaborators who are joining us online today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm hosting today's session, so I just want to cover some housekeeping before I introduce our presenters. So we know that the online environment can be a little bit tricky and connections can vary. So if you're experiencing some technical difficulties, please let our events team know by posting a message in the chat function. So you can find the chat function at the top toolbar of your screen, and one of our events team will do their best to help you. If you need to leave the Teams meeting for any reason because of technical difficulties, please know that when you rejoin us, you won't have lost your place in the presentations. If you'd like to turn captions on, you can do this via the Teams meeting setting. So click the three dots in your toolbar and then select language and speech and then live captions. We're really wanting today to be interactive as much as possible. So we have a series of presentations and then a panel and then a Q&A. But also if you have questions that pop into your mind throughout today, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. It might depend a little bit on timing as to when those questions are answered, but we're very keen for audience members to be involved in discussions. And if we don't get through all of those questions today, our presenters are happy to follow up with an email to respond. So as I mentioned before, we have a mixed program today. So we have three presenters who I'll introduce very shortly. We'll then open up to a broader panel session where we'll have some more people join that panel, and then we'll finish with a Q&A. But it's my great pleasure to introduce our three presenters who are outlined on the screen there. So I'll do introductions now, and that way our presenters can just move smoothly from one presentation to the next. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jessie Mitchell, who is a research fellow at the Hopkins Centre, and Jessie will be presenting on the findings of a study that she led that involved in-depth qualitative interviews looking at personalised pathways to employment following brain and spinal cord injury. Jessie will hand over to Tania. Tania Goosen is a senior vocational rehabilitation counsellor for the Back2Work Project in Spinal Life Australia. Tania will be discussing benefits of employment at any time point after spinal cord injury, and she'll focus on pathways to work, available supports, and how people can get them set up for sustainable and inclusive work opportunities. And then our third presenter is Kerrin Watter, who is a speech therapist and service manager at the Acquired Brain Injury Outreach Service. Kerrin's also former clinical lead at ABI VR. Kerrin will be discussing consumer and clinician perspectives on vocational rehabilitation after acquired brain injury, including the lessons learned from the development and implementation of a framework to support early team-based provision of vocational rehabilitation. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Jessie Mitchell. Thanks, Jessie.
Thanks so much, Tamara. So, as Tamara mentioned, I'd like to present on a project that we've been doing involving case studies of sustained employment following acquired brain or spinal cord injury. And we're fortunate to have support of a Hopkins seed grant for this project, as well as a really large and talented group of researchers, clinicians, and people with lived experience of disability from the Hopkins Centre at Griffith University, as well as Metro South Health and Spinal Life Australia, some of who you'll see here today. So we know that neurological injuries present a really huge life disruption for people, including to their work lives. And you may know that there's been quite a lot of focus on initial return to work after an injury for people, but less so on what that looks like over the longer term. And we suspect that even successful initial return to work doesn't necessarily predict sustained long-term employment for people. And so through this study, we really aim to gain in-depth insight into people's real life journeys following brain injury and spinal cord injury towards sustainable long-term employment. And so to do this, we used in-depth case study methodology, qualitative case study methodology. And so we recruited 6 people with brain injuries and 6 people with spinal cord injuries who had sustained employment for at least 12 months continuously with the same employer post-injury. And we asked them to nominate one other person to participate in the study with them. And so for some people, this was their employer or a co-worker. For others, it was colleagues and friends or family or service providers. And so each of these participants participated in an in-depth semi-structured interview and then also a co-creation session to create individual employment journey maps to represent their experiences. And so today I'd really like to share the findings of that in-depth qualitative analysis from the interviews and then use those individual journey maps to illustrate what some of those enablers look like in practicality for people. So what we found in our analysis was an in-depth kind of look at each individual's person's experiences and what those commonalities were. And what we found was that people had really personalized pathways to sustained employment. So time to work post-injury ranged from 6 months to 8 years for people. And at the time of participating in the study, time of continuous employment with the same employer for people ranged between 12 months and 23 years, which was incredibly impressive regardless. 7 of our 12 participants returned to the same employer post-injury, although all had altered duties or were in a different role. And 5 participants had to apply for jobs in different professions or industries, and 2 of those engaged in additional university study as part of this. And so these individualized pathways were represented by those 2 themes on the screen around flexibility and change and enabling resources. So looking at flexibility and change, this really related to how people thought about and participated in work. And so this involved an initial period of adaptation and adjustment to injury-related changes, which were obviously physical, psychological, cognitive, social, emotional, sensory. And so that period of adaptation really varied for people. So for someone like Matt, who you can see at the bottom of the screen, that took 8 years as he searched for a different occupation as he was previously working in agriculture and couldn't continue to work in that field after his spinal cord injury. Whereas for someone like Dave, who's at the top of the screen, he was able to return to work with the same employer after his brain injury and so started a graduated return to work plan after 6 months. And so what we found is those kind of varied factors, those individual and work factors that varied people's kind of career trajectory. And for many people, we found that their injury interrupted their previous career trajectory and made them reconsider their career goals and timelines. So if you look at someone like Matt, you can see that point 10 on his journey map, there's other important and meaningful activities. He had been able to purchase 25 acres of land to kind of fulfill his need for that agricultural work and it adapted a ride-on mower. And so that combined with his young family and managing his health and well-being was what was really important to him. And so he was balancing that with a 4-day work week. And speaking of adjusted work hours, there was obviously reasonable accommodations that needed to be flexible and change as people's needs changed over time, and that related to their personal and work goals and duties, as well as their injury-related needs. And so there's accommodations related to things like work arrangements, so reduced work hours or altered times. Matt was starting a little bit later so he could finish his personal cares before he got to work. It might have involved work methods. So Dave was still struggling with some issues around memory and fatigue post-injury, and so structure and routine were really important to him, and he had created an elaborate setup with spreadsheets and screen recording devices so that he was able to stay on top of his work and and organise and continue to work in a meaningful and productive way. And then obviously, as you might expect, adjustments to work premises to make them more accessible. And so that also included transportation options. So for Dave, he experienced a seizure after returning to work and wasn't able to drive for 6 months. And so having a really supportive team who was able to drive him to and from work during the wet season in his small mining town was really valuable and enabled him to continue working in a way that he might not have been able to otherwise. So what enabled, as you might have already heard, though, that flexibility and change was a series of different resources. So first up were personal resources, and this is kind of around the importance or value of work for people and their drive to return to work. And everyone we engaged with, work was an important part of their identity, and they wanted to continue to do that in some way. Their self-advocacy to ask for support and accommodations, the professional knowledge and expertise that they had prior to the injury that they could rely on post-injury and continue to build on, maybe a little bit more slowly than they had previously, and support from friends, family, and peers. And I think what we heard was, and what we were hoping to do with these journey maps, is to create a sense of peer support for people about what the employment possibilities might be, so that people had a sense of hope and started to be able to think about the employment possibilities early on. So someone like Dan was able to return to a role in workplace health and safety in the same team in a different role, but he was able to rely on the 20 years of experience he's had with that organisation in that role to really continue to be an asset to his team. And then we also looked at rehabilitation and employment services as being really valuable, as I'm sure is not surprising, particularly those vocational rehabilitation services and those early inpatient vocational rehabilitation services, but also access to ongoing support. So the idea that your needs change over time, and so you should be able to access services and support to adjust as time goes on, what your workplace accommodations are, what your career goals are. And of course, funding to access these services, but also funding for workplace accommodations, and also in terms of income protection. So if you're not working full-time to try and manage your other health and personal needs, do you have income protection or a disability support pension to help supplement your income? And so for Sarah, for example, she was able to continue studying her university degree with the help of the disability support pension, because she wasn't able to return to her part-time job. But that kind of allowed her and gave her the confidence to finish her degree and then find employment and get off that kind of support. And then obviously workplace support. So inclusive workplaces were ones where people already had personal relationships, and so they felt known and supported, or they could build new relationships with people in inclusive and diverse workplaces. And supported by people who either had knowledge and understanding of disability or were open to understanding and having those conversations in a supportive environment. Bigger organisations often had more resources and support to help people in terms of processes to support gradual return to work, and also funding to support workplace accommodations or additional staff to fill in for duties that people weren't able to complete themselves in the initial return to work period or over the longer term. So, for example, Sarah was had to do a workplace placement as part of her university degree and really struggled to find an internship, but was able to find one with a spinal cord injury organisation who was really supportive of her. And they had a support worker on staff to help with things like photocopying and more physical tasks. And for her, that was a really safe environment that she stayed in for about 8 years through different roles until she was able to find what she was really passionate about and really aligned with her career goals. So I think that's enough from me. I think what I wanted to finish on was a video of one of our participants, Zivan, who is a platform engineer at a university, so a job that I know nothing about, but he was able to return after his acquired brain injury, and has been working there for over a year now, and he kind of had this recommendation or advice around the importance and value of returning to work after an injury. So if I've done this right.
A big part of it is also your mind as well, like what your personality and what's your motivation, you know what I mean? like whether you need to pay for the bills or you need money for that, or you needed to, for me it was like my family and things like that. And then I needed to have like a purpose, What I realize now is that I can still be functional and I can still be contribution to the, my colleagues, my family, society, basically. You do need to accept your condition, and then you sort of look forward for some improvements and whatever goals you have, targets in your own mind, what you want to do for life and things like that. I would say that's one of those critical things. You need to be able to, or take a risk, basically. Take a try. Just try it and see. If it, you can wash out, fine, but otherwise you just try it,
That's me done, and Zivan has said it much better than I ever could anyway. So I will hand over to Tania. I think I've used up all of my allocated time. So I'll hand over to Tania, who's going to present the Back2Work project and her wealth of knowledge from her career there.
Thanks so much, Jessie. Could you just flick across, please, Michaela? So just to give you guys a quick snapshot, Back2Work is a pilot project offering early intervention vocational rehabilitation to people with newly acquired spinal cord injury or damage, and has been running since 2016. Just last week, we actually got our 500th referral to the program. The program is available statewide to patients under the care of QSCIS in eligible Queensland hospitals. Regional patients are assisted via telehealth. The project is a collaboration between Spinal Life Australia and Metro South Health, and is proudly funded by the Motor Accident Insurance Commission. Griffith University was a founding partner, and our research on employment after spinal cord injury ran for 6 years and reported a return to work rate of over 50%, which is pretty impressive, just so. Back2Work provides comprehensive vocational support for inpatients and can then continue for up to 12 months post-discharge under our current funding arrangements. We work closely with the multidisciplinary teams in our partner hospitals and community services. Assistance and advice is available to employers to support safe and sustainable return to work when participants are ready. The program is voluntary with a highly individual, holistic, strengths-based approach. We offer support to explore options around work and study, and can also assist patients who are just not quite sure what they want to do. Our team of 4 ASOC registered rehabilitation counsellors bring more than 70 years of experience in the disability employment sector, which makes me feel pretty old. So what are the benefits of work? We know that work is really good for people. The Royal Australian College of Physicians Health Benefits of Good Work initiative from 2011 is based on compelling Australasian and international evidence that good work is beneficial to people's health and well-being, and that long-term work absence and unemployment generally have a negative impact. So engagement in employment and other meaningful vocational activities can reduce the incidence of depression, reduce perceived pain, and lower suicide risk factors. The individual financial benefits are obvious. So earning an income can increase someone's capacity to purchase goods and services, and even like health promoting items like private therapy, gap costs and medication, and can reduce or eliminate reliance on income support and welfare payments. Caregivers can also potentially return to paid employment. Economic participation brings further whole of government benefits like health savings, income tax gains, and retaining skilled and experienced workers in the labour force. Even further, employment has hugely positive impact on families, co-workers, employers and communities. This is especially important in regional and rural communities where alternative employment opportunities can be limited. So we know that returning someone to work after any injury is beneficial, and it makes financial sense. When someone returns to work after a catastrophic injury, those benefits are exponential. So why is early intervention so important? Early intervention offers a really unique opportunity to save jobs that might otherwise be lost while someone's in hospital and preserve a sense of work identity. Early access to vocational counselling can provide alternative ideas about work roles and, like Jessie said, plant that seed of hope that work might be possible when I'm ready. By normalising return to work as just another part of rehab, we can promote the benefits of return to work, share stories and images of people with spinal cord injury working in a variety of roles. We can help build positive expectations about return to work after any catastrophic injury. Motivation and participation in rehabilitation can even be enhanced by talking about vocational goals and linking someone's therapy to essential work tasks like walking in steel-cap boots or using handheld tools. Our Griffith research showed that there's a clear 2-year window of opportunity post-injury. After this point, return to employment drops off significantly for each further year of disengagement for the workforce. So it's super important. While early encouragement is vital, we also know that not everybody is ready. Some people choose to focus on rehabilitation or other life roles, and some need long-term support to identify their options if they can't return to those pre-injury roles. For these groups, nurturing realistic hope for the future is really critical. If people believe that employment is possible, they're more likely to create and take up potential opportunities to progress to work, some of those little stepping stones, and can avoid many of the negative consequences of long-term unemployment. So we can achieve some really amazing results with participants in this early space, like Jacques that you see there. But encouraging and supporting people with spinal cord injury to engage in work is really important at any stage of life. So there's so many factors that go into building really inclusive and sustainable work opportunities. This is just my summary of the key ingredients. So appropriately open, and I emphasise appropriately open, respectful two-way communication. So when you're talking about your disability at work, we suggest that people try and find that Goldilocks spot. So kind of not too much and not too little, and that's really crucial. Employers also need to ensure that people feel safe to discuss disability and adjustments at all stages of employment. We see that inclusive employment is a journey, not a destination. It's something that you always need to keep working at, and it takes mutual responsibility and commitment from the employer and the employee. This has to be a partnership where both parties are committed to making it work and are both prepared to invest a little to get a really great result. It needs to be really genuine and purposeful work. Everyone wants to feel like they're contributing to the team, and people just want to know that they're doing their job effectively, like Dan mentioned. Good management is also really important. So addressing issues like poor performance or attitude can't be dismissed. Flexibility is really key. So that might be work hours, work duties, or where work is performed. So work from home is a great example of that. We know that people's energy levels are commonly affected after a spinal cord injury. Physical and cognitive load can impact them in different ways, on different days, and in different environments. So having a range of flexible options can be a huge help. A genuine willingness to be creative is really important. So can an employer use the person's skills and experience in a different way, like Jessie's last guy that she talked about, and focus on the things that they can do? Think outside the square and be really proactive. Try and come to discussions about adjustments with a problem-solving focus. The right equipment can be a game changer, and I know Belinda will talk a little bit about this later. If there's a gap between the person's capacity and the task requirements, reasonable adjustments or equipment solutions might be available, and hopefully you've got a glimpse of some of these as I've been talking today. Job access can help with advice and funding for work-related equipment. Technology is advancing all the time, so just keep looking for those ideas and build up your AT toolkit. Invisible aspects of disability can be particularly tricky to manage. You might choose to explain to your supervisor why you need 15 minutes in the bathroom, and they might need a reminder. And yes, it is tiring to keep doing this time after time. If it's not working, you could try a fact sheet or try some formal disability awareness training that can help educate your employer if you're finding that that's a barrier. Having trusted supports is really essential. So your friends and family, trusted work colleagues and your formal care team will be really invaluable for problem solving, also to celebrate success and a bit of help if you've had a rough day. Being able to ask for appropriate help if you need it is also really important. So practice some of those help-seeking behaviours. If you're not yet ready for work, there's plenty of other pathways to help you build your capacity and your confidence. And the good news is these pathways often deliver the same health and social benefits as paid work. You might consider study. So a short course might help you improve your computer skills. You could start a certificate at TAFE or jump into tertiary study at university. If you've recently graduated, a graduate program or an internship might be a great option. Along the same vein, a short period of unpaid work experience or work exposure might help you road test your ideas for a new job. You can use work experience to check your physical capacity. So can you actually cope with 15 hours a week, or is it far too much? Work experience can be a great way to showcase your skills and your attitude to a potential employer as well. Volunteering is one of those other opportunities to learn new skills, develop your confidence, meet new people and make some gradual changes to your routine if you need to, without the pressure and the commitment of paid work. There's opportunities in just about every industry. I'd suggest you check Volunteering Queensland's website for a huge list of possibilities right across the state. And lastly, probably introduce some work-like activities or structure into your routine. So if you need to start work at 9 o'clock, you might need to gradually change your personal care routine to prepare for this. If you need some help to dress in work clothes, maybe start practicing this now. Grab all those old clothes out of the cupboard or look into magnetic buttons or zip closures. Start with one small change to help you prepare for work. Keep it nice and manageable. If you need some help around any stage of employment, support is out there. So Back2Work can help if you have a newly acquired injury. If you have NDIS or NISQ funding, you could talk to your supports coordinator or a supports planner. They might be able to fund some individualised assistance from an employment professional like a rehab counsellor, a specialist OT or a psychologist to help you work out what you want to do and achieve your work goals. Keep an eye out for community-based programs like Skilling Queenslanders for Work and Spinal Life Australia's recent Ready to Work program. So these are often available even if you don't have any formal funding. If you're offered a paid job or already working but need some help with disability-related barriers in the workplace, Job Access's Employment Assistance Fund provides advice, a free assessment and potential funding for work-related equipment and modifications. Lastly, Disability Employment Services, which have just got a brand new name, and Workforce Australia are free government services that support people with a wide range of disabilities to find work. There's providers across the country and you don't need to be in receipt of a Centrelink benefit. If you are a confident self-advocate, know what work you want to do, and you are prepared to explain the impact of your spinal cord injury, they could be a good option to look into. So I'd like to just wrap up by acknowledging our funder, again, the Motor Accident Insurance Commission, our partner Metro South Health and all the Queensland Health staff who've trusted us to offer this program to 500 of their patients and the participants who have agreed to share their stories and images today. So just to wrap everything up, if you dream big, work hard and have good support, plus believe in yourself, so much is possible. The right job is out there. I might just hand straight over to Kerrin Watter, who's a speech pathologist and brings a wealth of experience in vocational interventions for people with an acquired brain injury. All yours, Kerrin.
Thanks so much, Tania. That was great to hear. And I will just check. Hopefully I am sharing my slides properly now. And just somebody shout out to me if I'm not, because I can't see anymore. Hi, everyone. My name's Kerrin. I'm going to talk today about how different ways that we can support the delivery of vocational rehabilitation to people with acquired brain injury, and recognising the work I'm talking about today has occurred within the ABI Transitional Rehab Service at Metro South Health, which has been funded through the Hopkins Centre and MACE grant funding. So how can we as clinicians support people with ABI who have goals of returning to work, paid employment, unpaid volunteer work, or those meaningful occupational activities? So we've done a fair bit of work in this area, and you've possibly heard us talk before on the work we've undertaken to support clinicians to deliver evidence-based vocational rehab for adults with acquired brain injury, particularly early in recovery. So we did a number of studies that led to the development of an evidence-based framework for ABI vocational rehabilitation. And we also developed some workshops and tools and a vocational training manual that support clinicians to take a component of that framework and translate and implement it into their everyday practice. And I think over the last few years, they've had 5 of these workshop series have been run across the state, training over 90 clinicians in this evidence-based approach. But today, I'm going to talk about some of the work that's fed into that framework and highlight some findings we found out from our consumer and our clinician studies, and just really think about what are those things that are important for us as clinicians to be considering when we work with clients who have vocational goals. And it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so please reach out for me after this if you have any other questions. Examined the views and experiences of people with brain injury and allied health professionals working in Queensland regarding their experiences of VOC rehab and returning to work in Queensland. And we also asked them about their perceptions of what an ideal service would look like. For our clinicians, we also wanted to find out what they were doing in practice, and we investigated their clinical practice methods to identify pathways, services, models and frameworks and tools. What were they doing in practice? For our consumers, we spoke with 8 people with brain injury who were on average 45 years old, 5.5 years post-injury, and of our 8 people, 5 people were undertaking paid employment, so 4 with an employer and 1 who was self-employed. 2 people were not undertaking paid employment but involved in volunteering, and 1 was still continuing with rehabilitation. And we spoke to our consumers through focus groups and interviews and conducted a thematic analysis. For our allied health professional study, we had information from 34 clinicians, and by and large, these were experienced clinicians with an average sort of 15 years in the business. We did this through focus groups and online surveys and analysed this through a content analysis. And our clinicians came from a range of different areas of provision, so private, public, not-for-profit, insurance schemes. So firstly, to our consumer findings, we had 5 themes we found from our people with injury around their views and experiences in Queensland for VOC rehab. So how that was addressed in their rehabilitation, those facilitators of recovery and returning to work, how important it was to be working again and their experience of work, identity and brain injury, and information around services, systems and policies. And our consumers also identified what those ideal services would look like. So in our first theme, addressing VOC rehab in rehabilitation, the quotes from "it was awesome" to "they just weren't working towards it" pretty much sums up those experiences of being very varied depending on the services you were linking with. So we found that depending on the types of services you had, the types of funding, which part of the state you lived in, you often got quite a different experience, even within the same HHS. Our participants identified that their rehab was impacted by their own insight and awareness, and having that really strong desire to return to work from early in rehabilitation, and reflecting back on how that might have impacted their participation early on in recovery. and also leading to conflicting expectations between clients and their therapy teams during rehab, not just early in recovery, but also down the track. And some of that was that conflict of, well, I want to get to an even higher level than where you're discharging me at. The need and wanting for education and information provision, having access to services and availability of services, and the positives and challenges with this, and very importantly, that therapeutic skill and alliance. So positives around having clinicians with expertise, providing personalised and contextual services, and that feeling of a good therapeutic alliance. The negatives were feeling that their therapy was generic, it wasn't addressing needs or individual, and having poor stakeholder communication. Second theme were those facilitators of recovery and return to work. So you need to want it yourself. So our people with injury talked about themselves and that sense of self, what they brought, their personal qualities, and how that was a major facilitator in their recovery. And also that being that ability to engage in meaningful activity after injury. The impact of services, systems and policy. So do you have access to workplace supports, access to rehab and funding? And again, the importance of the therapists you're working with and the rehab team around you and the skills they bring. In our third theme, our clients talked about how important work was and the experience of working again. So firstly, and our quote of "it's your identity," when it's taken from you, you feel like you have nothing, I think would probably resonate with many of the clinicians listening today. So our clients talked about how the loss of work is devastating, how important work is on that sense of self and identity, how it provides structure and purpose. And when it's gone, gosh, what do you do then? They talked around their expectations of work after ABI and how this did change over time, related to both changes in insight and their own experiences in life and in attempting to return to work and in returning to work. Experiences of return to work was another sub-theme where people were also developing that awareness of readiness over time. They had those varied processes and supports in place in the workplace, and those experiences, whether they were positive or negative, and challenges possibly in managing working relationships and difficulties in seeking and maintaining employment. The importance of having good employer engagement and good communication was highlighted, and the negatives of having that limited awareness of what was going on, poor communication between employers and rehab teams. And the fifth sub-theme was around current function and goals. So whether people were satisfied with where they were on their workplace journey, and also whether people were being satisfied with the meaningful activities they were being engaged in. And interestingly, of the participants who were involved in this study, they all had ongoing vocational goals and workplace goals, regardless of their work status, even those who'd been back at work for many years. Our fourth theme talked to ABI and identity, so that struggle with who I was and who I am right now. And with this theme of work and identity and brain injury and identity was coming through many of these different themes. So this was identifying those changes related to the injury itself and the challenges that were ongoing, and they were adapting to this, how they were impacting themselves and those changes as how they related to the workplace. How our people with injury adapted to change, so establishing new identities, roles, and also when rehab finishes, what does identity look like then? And then the relationship impacts and that difficulty maintaining relationships across many, many different domains. So friendships, home, and as well as at work. And then our fifth theme was around services, systems and policy. So needing services that can support you back into work, and whether that's through a legislated process, so legislation, policies, access, and then within services having processes and supports in place. And I think all the speakers today have so far talked about those different services and systems. Views on ideal services included having more education, more service provision, involving employers, having those workplace supports, and what did they look like for you? Is that a buddy system? Is that having more contact with your manager? And having an idea of peer mentors to provide support, inspiration, and this hope for people. And really, if I think of what can we take from our consumers and what they've told us is how important that individualised, specialised VOC rehab is after brain injury, and having that really solid therapeutic alliance between clinicians and clients. And I think that we have to remember that for the people we work with, these goals and wants of wanting to return to work are happening amongst these really large changes in identity and sense of self, changes at home, changes in family dynamics. And I think we need to be really mindful of that as a group as we are working with our clients and as clinicians. And I think I've probably run out of time about there, and I'm going to show one final slide from our clinician study. And I think it's my most boring slide, but it's my most exciting finding, I think, is that in our clinician study, one of our findings were, what would ideal service provision look like from a clinician lens? And we were able to identify what different phases of vocation people might be progressing through in their rehab, and what types of clinical activities could those rehab teams be undertaking depending on that phase. So I think that's a really lovely finding to give back to the industry. All right, I'm going to stop talking there and stop sharing my screen, and I will hand on back over to Tamara.
Thanks so much, Kerrin. I'd like to thank all three presenters for such excellent, thought-provoking presentations, sharing your insights from research as well as clinical experience, and your specialised experience in this field is just unparalleled in my humble opinion. It's now my pleasure to introduce the panel session, and so we'll have our presenters come over to the panel, but we're also being joined by some new people. So it's my pleasure to introduce Belinda McLeod, who is a Vocational Rehabilitation Counsellor at Back2Work Project at SLA, and Belinda also has lived experience of working after a spinal cord injury. And I'd also like to welcome Sarah Kecke, who is an occupational therapist at ABI TRS. We were also planning to have Tim Matthews on the panel. So Tim is a person with lived experience of returning to work after acquired brain injury. In fact, Tim returned to work in the aviation field, but because he's so incredibly busy and productive in his work role, he actually wasn't able to join us. But what he did do is actually pass on his thoughts and ideas in relation to some of the questions that will be posed to the panel. So Jessie will actually be Tim's proxy for today, as well as representing Jessie herself. So she's got quite a split personality for the panel, but I'm sure we'll cope with that fine. So I'd like to get the ball rolling for our panel members and offer them some questions. So the first question is, we know that not everyone has the opportunity to go through your wonderful programs in terms of receiving specialist vocational rehabilitation support. So I'm really keen to know, how can clinicians who don't necessarily work in the employment space help someone explore returning to work after a neurological injury? I might ask Tania if you've got some particular insights on what advice you'd provide those clinicians.
Yeah, great question, Tamara. Look, we know that encouraging people to work takes a village approach, and not everybody has to have that really high level experience. Everyone can contribute something. Talking positively about work in that context of your rehab, having images of people who are working around your practice or in that area where people are congregating can be really motivating, because you can't be what you can't see. So yeah, having some really powerful and motivating images can be super helpful. We've already mentioned ways that you can integrate some of those really meaningful tasks from work, potentially into therapy, could be a wonderful way of building that confidence. And just, yeah, don't lose sight of how important hope is. Maybe framing up some options if you're not quite sure where that person's functional recovery may end up. You know, don't ever exclude anything. Maybe just frame it up as maybe this is an option for you. You could have a couple of options that you scale down. But yeah, just being prepared to talk about work, I think, is a really key part.
Sounds like a lovely approach. I might now ask Sarah, from your point of view, what advice would you offer clinicians?
I agree with everything that Tania said, but I think some of the things that we do well at ABI TRS is really helping the person to understand the processes involved in going back to work, and that it's not sort of something that just happens straight away necessarily. But I think understanding those processes can help with, working with the client to make that happen. But also exploring that work role, breaking it down, what's involved, and simulating those tasks and practicing those things. A lot of us as clinicians have that experience to be able to do that task analysis, whether you understand or have experience with getting people back to work, where you know how to assess function. So I guess working on that if you can, and having the client reflect on their performance and how that relates or potentially could relate to going back to work. Is sort of that sort of starting point before sort of needing to actually talk to the employer and get into the nitty-gritty of things.
Great, good advice. Thanks, Sarah. Jessie, either representing yourself or Tim, what advice would you have to clinicians?
I'll represent Tim this time because he's written a great response that I can't beat. And so he's said, in his own words, that the best support someone can provide is a listening ear, empathy, and understanding, and a way forward. And he's described it based on his own experiences as a bit of a perilous journey, and it can be drawn out and uncertain at times. And so it's helpful as a patient or a client, if the clinician is acutely aware of this, and I think building on what Sarah was saying, that kind of transparency around communicating realistically what that might look like. But he's also said that even seemingly insignificant steps all add up. And so if it's in the clinician's scope of practice, you know, doing those small tasks, modified activities to build up, to simulate the work experience, build confidence in your ability to perform that particular skill. And I think, you know, he's talking not just about those work-specific roles, but Tania mentioned, you know, getting dressed to go to work, and how do you get yourself to work in the first place. And so Tim was really felt that was really important, that clinicians could communicate the importance of that and work towards that in small steps.
Thanks, Jessie and Tim. We might move on to the next question. So after a neurological injury, it's well known that people can experience a range of physical and cognitive changes that influence the way that they previously were able to do their jobs. Do you have some examples of how you've been able to assist people to return to jobs that initially may not have seemed possible on the basis of the effects of their injury? I might go to Belinda for this one.
Great question. Thank you, Tamara. I look at any job as something that we'll put on the table and have a look at. So we will look at the person and what they want to do, look at the environment, the terrain, and the tasks. And probably 2 examples of somebody going back to a role that may have seemed a bit of a challenge to start with is an agriculture farming role. So we break this down like any other role. How do we get around the property? Let's look at maybe a modified buggy with hand controls. How do we check the fences? Let's look at a drone with modified controls. How do we deal with hot temperatures in rural and when thermoregulation is affected? Maybe we look at a racing car cooling vest or some neck air conditioners. Even mixing chemicals when you can't reach above your head, there's ways to look around it. For our auto electricians and mechanics, we look at really innovative solutions, and these solutions are co-designed with our participants. So I find working with people, they are solution focused and they have the most amazing ideas, and I'm really lucky to work with them on that. But with the mechanics, we found a hoist in the States, which is a power chair that converts into a mechanical creeper, and it's on its way to Australia at the moment. So that allows somebody to be able to get under vehicles and equipment to work on them without having to transfer in and out of their manual chair all day. So I would encourage people, if they're not quite sure whether that physical role is going to be possible, have a look, break it down into those tasks and be really innovative and left field in coming up with those solutions. And job access is an incredibly helpful scheme that can help people apply for some funding if it's work related and disability related as well.
Thanks, Belinda. Kerrin, could I ask you to expand on this to think from more ABI and cognitive impacts and how you've worked with clients to resume work that may not initially have seemed possible?
Tamara, I'm going to throw this one over to Sarah, if that's okay. I could, but she's going to have a much more recent example than problem. I will, if that's all right.
Sure.
I guess for us, often if it doesn't seem possible to get people back to work, or we're thinking it's a bit more difficult, they're probably unlikely to go back in the 10 weeks that we're with them. But in saying that, it's not something that we write off. We're still working towards that with clients. And I guess we're simulating, and just like Belinda was referring to, breaking down those tasks, looking at what would be difficult to go back to in that role, trying to simulate it as much as we can. For example, we've had a builder in the past whose perceptual difficulties meant that they couldn't put a flat pack chair together because they were sort of trying to put it together like this instead of like this. And initially it seemed really impossible that he would get back to building a house. But we started with making physio wedges during therapy sessions, which is difficult, but improved the second time around. Then he returned home and was making mud kitchens, and we've since heard that he has been able to go back to being a builder within 12 to 18 months after going back home. So that was something that's, we didn't expect to happen, but was able to happen over that longer term. We've also done things like we've had personal trainers who have gone through the process of setting up programs and running us through our paces. So sort of getting involved and sort of doing those sorts of simulated activities, or linking people in with volunteering activities like e-waste, or going to Wheel Nuts, which is another mechanic type NDIS funded program. So sort of linking people in with those work hardening type opportunities to, I guess, give them that option. But we've also had people who have had significant visual impairments that were unlikely to get better, like hemianopias, who are crane operators, and the two of those things don't quite go together. So talking to those clients about thinking about all the skills that they already have in that industry and how they might be able to use those differently, and linking them with vocational counsellors or those longer term supports, private providers. So nothing as innovative and exciting as what Belinda was talking about, but certainly making those early steps towards helping people to be able to do what they want to.
Yeah, wonderful. Now balance. Oh, no, sorry, Kerrin, yes.
Tamara, I was just going to jump in because I needed to let Sarah go first, if that's all right.
Of course.
And just thinking about that, people have that different context at work often than they do in rehab. And I'm remembering a gentleman we worked with who had real challenges in controlling verbosity, controlling his emotional regulation and ability to stay on task. But the minute, out of desperation, I think his OT took him for a work assessment. The minute he was on site, I've got to be on site, my foreman's watching, a significant change in that ability to tap into those old behaviours that were really, that context of the workplace really helped reinforce, and did so much better than he was able to do in the clinic, at home, in the community. So just that knowledge of what happens in the workplace and those deep ingrained behaviours for people that really help support them keeping on track and give you some surprises as clinicians at how well people can do versus what you've seen in a different context. Thank you for letting me chip in.
No worries, Kerrin. You may not be off the hook though, because we've had a really important question posed in the chat. So I might actually jump to question in the chat because it flows on beautifully from what we've been speaking about. So Michelle, thank you for your question. Michelle's asked, what suggestions for adjustments with the cognitive challenges accompany an ABI? So maybe building on what you're saying in terms of what kind of adjustments you've supported clients with for cognitive effects.
And Michelle, that's a great question. And I think I'll start and then I'm sure Sarah will jump on top as one of our occupational therapists. But I think it also really thinks of what are people able to do and where do their skills lie? What are those strategies they're using? What are they? How effective are they? And then what are those demands of that work role? And that we all have really different work roles with different demands and different contexts. And for everyone, that's going to be very, very individualized. A strategy that works for me here might not work for me out in a different context or, you know, outside, or a visual strategy or an auditory strategy. So I think it's about knowing people, knowing the job they need to do, where their skills lie, and how easy it is to do some of those adjustments, and what supports are in place to help them do that successfully, and for how long too. Can they do it for an hour? But beyond that, that fatigue builds in. So it's a really complex picture of sort of trying to balance all those different needs. And that could be an unsatisfactory answer, because it's not like here are our top 5 or here are our top 10. You really need to get to know the person in that context. Sarah, did you?
Yeah. Anything further to add to that one?
I do agree with that it is individualized, and, you know, it can be having a checklist and working through that and ticking things off. It can be having that physical break from a computer task every hour, walking around. It can be so many different things to help with that. For some people, it can be having that time in your day where your colleagues don't come and talk to you, so that you can focus on what you're needing to do. And then having that allocated time for that social chat or the chat around work tasks with colleagues. So I guess it's looking at, all of those factors and trying to find and also the strengths of the client. So the clients are all going to have different strategies that will lend themselves better to them than it would to other people. So it's trying to be flexible and individualize it a bit, what was working for them before and what needs to be a bit more concrete now.
Yeah, and I imagine there's a mix of existing strategies that people were using before their injury that you can capitalise on, as well as learning new strategies because of challenges that now are, maybe not, those strategies aren't extending to support that. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Well, we're running out of time for our last question, but what I might do is be a little cheeky and kind of incorporate that into a bit of a summing up, because for me, we've heard about the importance of the job support match, personalised solutions, importance of work for identity, the importance of instilling hope and nurturing that hope despite the challenges, the ups and the downs. And we know from Jessie's findings that it can be a very long and winding road, but we also know how important it is to hear other people's positive stories and to be inspired by how others have achieved that. So Jessie, those interviews that you did with people and the stories that they shared, how important do you think it is for your support in that journey?
Yeah, I think when we first asked people, oh, did you encounter any other people, or how did you find this career path? Maybe they didn't have an immediate response, but then they'd say, oh, I ran into this guy who lived in my building who was also a wheelchair user, and I asked him what he did for work, and he worked at a call center, and that's where I started out. And so I think it's just, even those informal, but some people were really conscious in their efforts to find a sense of community and a group of other people who understood what they wanted out of life and what their goals were. And I think Tim has given me a response that kind of sums it up really nicely. And he says, recovery is a choice, and hearing another's journey gave me a sense of, okay, they were also in a terrible situation, but they chose to do everything in their power to recover, and they made it back to work and have a normalish life. If they could do it, I could too. And I think that was really echoed in almost all of our journey maps.
Yeah, and also in Tania's talk, dream big, work hard, get the right support. I think there's some very common themes that have come through today's session. Thank you all so much, to the panel members, to the presenters, for such a wonderful, I think, a very optimistic but also very realistic perspective on return to work. And I hope that our people online have found that really interesting. And I'm so sorry that we didn't get a lot of opportunity for questions. Sue, thank you so much for your comment. If there are any particular questions, please pose them and let us know who you're asking the question of, and we'll then share that with our presenters. But we do have to finish up now. So thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again for the next Hopkins Hour. Thank you very much.